Hello, this is Steven L. We are back with another top 10 video, and today we'll be doing the top 10 FBI Depression era public enemies. Now, for those of you who are out of the loop or don't know what this list is about, well, during the 30s, during the Great Depression in America, and the FBI, well, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, later known as the FBI, was starting to form, there were these many colorful bank robbers and kidnappers going across the Midwest and committing these crimes and becoming big in the papers. Now, these were the FBI's main target during essentially when the Bureau was beginning to form and really become a big fighting law enforcement organization. Now, some of these people on this list are some of the most infamous criminals in American history. Some of them are very well known. Some of them aren't very well known. Now, before I get into the list, I need to explain one thing. When I was doing my top 10, gangsters from all my lists, never once did I put a member of these criminals on the list, because I never considered them gangsters. I considered them, criminal masterminds or professional criminals. Not one that you would associate as a gangster. But that's just me. Others usually do. I don't. So with that out of the way, let's get into the list. Also take into account, this is personal opinion. I'm basing everyone on this list purely by either notoriety or just how criminal they were. So without that, I want to kick off with our number 10. Number 10 is going to Ma Barker, real name Kate Barker. Now, she is a myth. Well, her criminal notoriety is a myth that was created by the FBI. Now, Ma Barker was the mother of Fred Barker, and she had 3 other sons. One died in a suicide to prevent, going to prison. And essentially, her sons, and along with another notorious public enemy, became the backbone and created the infamous Barker Corpus gang that did high-stake bank robbery jobs and later got involved in kidnapping. Now, they were some of the most ruthless. Now, her gang was the most ruthless of the bunch, and also came away with a whole ton of dough. Eventually, like most of these guys, the life of being this professional robber caught up with them, with the majority of these guys ending up either dead or except for 2 ended up going to Alcatraz. One was the son, and the other was this notorious enforcer that often worked in the gang. Now, if you're asking, well, what's Ma Barker's role? Well, Ma Barker's role in the gang was nothing. The FBI created the myth that she ran the gang. She was never really a proper gangster that really ran the gang or masterminded their robberies. She was mostly an associate. But she has this big notoriety, whether it's deserved or not, and she did many ways encouraged her sons to continue an act of violent crimes. And she sadly died, not of old age, not of heartbreak. She died in a shootout. There was an infamous shootout with her and her son, Fred Barker, with the FBI. Now, what happened is, even though they both died, the FBI never really got any fingerprints to prove if she participated herself in the shooting. My personal belief is that she did. But with her dead, and the fact they didn't do it, there was no proof. And back then, killing an old lady, regardless of their role in a criminal organization, or the fact that his sons were criminals, would be considered horrible. So Hoover and the feds came up with the myth that she really ran the gang. And as a result, in most mediums, since her death, she lives in notoriety as this old lady, this mother that ran one of the most infamous criminal gangs in the Great Depression era. And honestly, even though it's not deserving, I will not deny the myth still intrigues me to this day. And yeah, so I put her at number 10 because really, even though she's the most infamous one of the most infamous names of that period, She was never really herself a real proper gangster. More of an associate and a person that was always, helping her sons avoid getting arrested. That's what she really did. Coming in at number 9, George Machine Gun Kelly Barnes. Probably one of the most infamous, another infamous name. George Barnes was essentially a failed bootlegger and eventually turned to bank robberies. Now, despite his name would suggest of being an expert with the machine gun and was so good he could write his name with it, that was not really the case. His preferred style was robbing banks, usually dressed like a businessman, walking in with a handgun and force the bank tellers to give the money and run. That was his real style. The name Machine Gun Kelly was courtesy of his wife at the time. Who wanted her husband to be this big notorious gangster and roll around with some of the big gangsters of the times. As a result, she became essentially his publicist and began to really live up her husband's notoriety. However, he would eventually get one of the biggest, breaks for criminal notoriety. He ended up kidnapping Wilbur Underhill. He was this big, oil tycoon, or eventually was this very rich man. He ended up kidnapping him and getting a huge ransom sum. Now, as a result of that, he got on the FBI's radar and despite his name, never died in a shootout. But he was arrested, and there was a legend that he uttered the phrase, "Don't shoot me, G-men." And because of that, the FBI during its 30s and 40s, 50s, and 60s always referred to themselves as G-men. And it became a sort of pride to be called that. He's considered the man responsible. George Machine Gun Kelly was eventually sent to Alcatraz, and he was eventually transferred to another prison where he died of old age. According to prison reports, he was a model prisoner. Essentially, he was this guy who wanted to be a big shot, but according to what I managed to find out, never really had that much of the stuff to really become a big time criminal. Also, I just realized I may refer to these people on this list as gangsters, because in many ways, even though they aren't, they are. Again, I'm kind of hypocriting what I said in the beginning of the video, but I realized what I just said about Mob Barker, and yeah, so he wanted to be this big shot, this big infamous criminal, but never really had the makings of it, and really, his infamous crime was just a big time kidnapping. That was really it. So that's why I kind of put him at number 9. Coming in at number 8, Frank Jelly Nash, a big-time bank robber and pioneer. This guy has a record as long as my arm, and he is just infamous. He was very big during the FBI's heyday. Now, and eventually, like most criminals of his time, they get caught. Now, you think about his story should really end there. But as you know, sometimes in a criminal life, that is not always the case. Now, before I get into his tragic, violent end, I need to state this. This man is often considered the most successful bank robber in U.S. history. And that really should show just how great of a bank robber he was. And his violent end, arguably, was another turning point in FBI history. When he was caught, and he was sent to Kansas City to catch a train, several policemen and FBI people were to help transfer him away. During what is considered a failed prison escape, to free him, resulted in his death and several other law enforcement officers. That event is often referred to as the Kansas City Massacre. Now, there is another bank robber who was rumored, a few bank robbers were rumored to have been involved in that shooting. Now, despite his very violent end, and the fact he's considered by many the most successful bank robber, his real big claim to fame is the Kansas City Massacre, being one of its unfortunate people to die in there. And he's not that well known, unlike probably most on this list. Hell, half of his guys probably don't even know half these people on this list. But he is really that, but he's just an interesting character to me. And the fact he is considered the most successful bank robber deserves a place on this list. Coming in at number 7, Wilbur Underhill, better known as the Tri-State Terror. That nickname should tell you all you need to know about this, well, former notorious bank robber. And that's what Wilbur Underhill is. A bank robber. Wilbur Underhill Jr. was pretty much a notorious criminal during the Depression era. He was the most wanted bandit in Oklahoma during the 20s and 30s, and he co-led a gang with Harvey Bailey and many notorious criminals from Cookson Hills. And essentially, he's been in and out of prison for quite a while, and was given a few life sentences, but he managed to escape nearly every time. Another nickname he got was Mad Dog, because he was really wild and crazy, and was considered wild and almost cuckoo. Eventually, he, like many people, they get on their radar, on FBI's radar, and eventually he was pursued by FBI and died in a shootout. Now, this all happened. Well, the shootout happened right around the time Underhill was celebrating his honeymoon with a friend and his friend's girlfriend. He died pretty much like how many probably want to go out around that time. And the fact that, honestly, just like Jelly Nash, he's very not that well known of this era, and probably doesn't have that notoriety. But the fact that, first off, his nickname has always been the Tri-State Terror, that should show you just how much of an influence and how much crime he caused to the people during that time period. And he was just one of that breed. He was just big. Number 6. Vern Miller. Unlike other of these guys, mostly come from poor backgrounds, mostly in farming land, maybe with the exception of Machine Gun Kelly, who kind of came from a good working class, even rich family, I think, or roughly, well, maybe not fully rich, but somewhere around that status. Vern Miller kind of came from that, but originally his life didn't start in crime. From what I found out, he had a normal childhood, I guess. He served in the U.S. Army and was a professional sharpshooter. When he came back, he got married and became a local sheriff of his hometown. But after his wife began to get ill, he embezzled a lot from the city's funds to help his dying wife. Eventually, people caught on, and he had to go on the run. Caught, did time in jail, came out and became a notorious hitman, and was mostly associated with the Kansas City Massacre. He too was kind of on the FBI's radar, but was more of a hitman than an actual bank robber like many people on this list. He had done some bank robbery jobs and was known as a prolific shooter. He was, in many ways, the image Machine Gun Kelly always wanted, but this guy had it. He too was like others on this list, very little known. And he was also kind of guy that got on everyone's bad side. He had a few beefs with Al Capone. He had a few beefs with the Purple Gang that he caused a lot of problems with. And he is believed to be of one of the many shooters involved in the infamous Kansas City Massacre. it was believed that he was trying to, rescue his friend Jelly Nash, but accidentally killed him. Now, because of the fact he was pissing off a lot of gangsters left and right, especially Kansas City, and he broke a rule that you could not go killing law enforcement, it's bad, he ended up getting killed. And honestly, the people that was rumored to have been involved in that went on the run courtesy of his death. And I realized that this would be punishment for those who were involved. And this other guy who is on this list, I will mention when we get to him, was rumored to have been a member of that. Vern Miller is just a unique gangster on this list, as actually he is a proper gangster. The rest were more professional bank robbers, professional criminals. This guy was a proper gangster and hitman, and the fact that just like many the other fews, he's not that well known or has that notoriety, but he is just a very fun and fascinating character, had a very fascinating background. I have to include him on this list. Number 5. Bonnie and Clyde. One of the most infamous pairings of the Depression era. These two had this legend that continues to live to this day. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were these two kindred spirits that fell in love and began bank robberies. Now, they had this romantic image because they were these outlaw young couples that the public instantly fell in love with. The FBI never really went after these two. It was more Texas Rangers type thing. They began doing some bank robberies and even robbed local gas stations. They weren't that quite wealthy, but they were the most well-oiled machine of criminals during their time period. These guys just like the image that you see of them, this young love, this young rebellion. But despite that, they have perhaps some of the most violent kill counts of anyone on this list. They were responsible for a lot of deaths, and honestly, their crimes were not that big. Again, they did not rob that much. But their infamous death, that infamous shootout, is seen in so many reels, seen in so many films that have been replicated. They are really, I think, when you think of the Depression era of these bank robbers, two come to mind. This pair and another one. But anyway, until we get to him, let's go to number 4. Alvin Creepy Corpus, truly the last great public enemy. Now, this guy is what's known as public enemy number 1. As during the FBI's heyday of catching these guys, there were really 4 guys that they were trying to get, and each would take the public enemy number 1 slot. Creepy Corpus was a member of the Corpus Barker gang, their top enforcer. But was just at around the time their gang was becoming successful and notoriety, the problem is they were now part of a dying breed. These old school criminals of these bank robberies in the Midwest, when the FBI was getting their act together, taking them down, many of them were either dead or arrested. The Corpus gang was next on the FBI's list when they went too far kidnapping people they shouldn't have. You see, most of these guys preferred bank robberies. It was easier. But kidnapping was a federal crime, and as a result, the FBI would come down on your head. Most of his gang would either be dead or arrested. Creepy Corpus got the nickname Creepy because of his creepy smile. He did time in prison when he was young, and ironically for many of these guys, when you go to prison, it's like an education. You go there, they teach you the ropes, they teach you how to be a criminal, and when you come out, you become this big criminal. Corpus was named public enemy number 1 and was the last of that era. His arrest was considered where that era, the public enemies, were gone for good. These old school guys were no longer necessary. They were in many ways obsolete, and honestly, I put him at number 4 because he was considered the last. And honestly, he might be probably the most he was part of the most violent gang of that era. And I had to feel that number 4 is a spot that he deserves. Coming in at number 3. George Babyface Nelson. Real name Lester Gillis. Many of these guys, again, came from more farming land backgrounds. There have been exceptions in other cases. This guy's another exception, as he was really from the Chicago area. Lester Gillis eventually took the alias George Nelson, which he preferred, but because of his status and appearance, the media and law enforcement referred to him as Babyface Nelson, though no one ever used that in his presence. He was a notorious criminal that did many crimes, and even though that is his own right, he really gained notoriety when he both helped and joined the infamous John Dillinger gang. This guy is a true wild card, and it had a complete erratic behavior that felt like it was taken straight out of an old school gangster movie. Eventually, after the gang's leader's death, and that gang leader was considered public enemy number 1, the next guy to become public enemy number 1 wasn't his, and he was always furious he never got that title. Eventually, he did get that title of public enemy number 1, and he was responsible for more FBI agents' deaths in the field than probably any other on this list. Eventually, he ended up getting killed and was found dead on the side of the freeway one day. Now, out of all the public enemies, or the guys that got the number 1 slot, he was considered a guy that really was the guy that was most justified in the FBI taking down. He had no romantic aura about him compared to others. He was just a complete erratic wild card that just shot up and honestly never liked being either played second fiddle, or never liked how people just looked at him as this short man and hated his nickname. He's truly the most violent. He might be one of the most violent, maybe even enough to be more violent than creepy Corpus, but he's just there. He's just there. Number 2. Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. Another notorious name. Now, Pretty Boy Floyd was often considered, also got another nickname, Robin Hood of Crooks and Hills. He was always a rebel in his youth. Eventually, he did try to straight life, but the money wasn't working, and working on his family's farm was also not helping. Again, the Great Depression, many of these guys turned to this, because it was the only way out. But again, this was before the Depression, but the farming land had hit them rough. Eventually, he too was sent to prison. During his time there, he learned the criminal education, came out, and became a successful bank robber. One of the most infamous bank robbers. Now, his nickname, Pretty Boy Floyd, came from a rumor that when he went to a notorious gangster hangout, a pretty lady called him, "What are you up to, pretty boy?" and the name stuck. He became a big-time bank robber and was responsible for many robberies. However, there were some that he was not yet proven of. He was arrested and was sent on a train, but however, he managed to escape, and that just added more to the allure of his legend. Another thing is that he was rumored to have done, when he robbed banks, he ripped up the deeds, so that way the banks could not take people's home. It was even said during his notoriety, he went back to his hometown and robbed the town bank, and everyone didn't tip off the police, but went to see an actual bank robbery be done, and he had this lure about him. But eventually things, catch up to you. Him and his partner eventually were going to Kansas City, where, you guessed it, the Kansas City Massacre took place. And Pretty Boy Floyd has often been considered to be one of the people involved. However, there is proof that he never was. It was just because Hoover was stubborn and honestly thought that this guy was responsible because he was in the area. That was it. There was no real proper proof. And as a result, because of the Kansas City Massacre and him being public enemy number 1, he had to go on the run. And honestly, he was hiding out in New York and he would still be safe there, but he got itchy and had to make his way home. Eventually, the F.B.I. caught up with him and he pretty much went on the run and went to a local farmhouse where he met this nice lady. And this nice lady, because back in those days, you never turn away a stranger, but he let him into her house, cooked her a meal, and he gave her a big tip, said this meal was fit for a king, and he asked if he could get into town today. Just as he was leaving, the FBI cars rolled up. Now, he refused to fire a shot on the lady's property because he had been nice to her, and she'd been nice to him. He just couldn't do it. So what happened was, he made a run for it. Even though he knew he was going to probably get killed, like many of these guys, they refused to go back to prison. They've had their time. Refused to go back, and he ended up getting killed. Now, there's two different accounts to what happened. One was he was shot, wounded, and died from that wound. The other was he was shot and then executed at point-blank range. But even to his death, he still denied being a member of being involved with the Kansas City Massacre, and he hated his name, Pretty Boy. I've always found him just to be a colorful, and I honestly was tempted to put him at number 1 because I found him to be truly the most rebel of these guys on this list. But I had to, be in good conscience, give it to arguably the most infamous name of the Great Depression era. Number 1 goes to John Dillinger. Probably the most infamous name of the Great Depression. John Dillinger, again, like Floyd, came back from humble working class family. Lower class and that farming land type of thing. He wasn't a fan of working hard, and he was always a rebel. Eventually, he was sent to prison. It was rumored he did time in the Navy, then AWOL, but he did time in prison. During his time, he met fellow friends, fellow notorious bank robbers, and learned a lot from them. When he got out, he pulled off a job to quickly break them all out, and these guys became the backbone of what was the Dillinger Gang. They were the most infamous notoriety gang out there. It was also that because they were so successful with bank robberies, they got on the FBI's radar. And John Dillinger was the first public enemy number 1. And he would constantly, get away from the FBI. He did 2 famous jailbreaks during his lifetime, but was famously gunned down outside a Chicago movie theater, and his death began what would be a common trend for these notorious bank robbers of that era, dying in a hail of bullets, and his death is just one of the most infamous in Chicago, not just one of the most infamous deaths in Chicago, but one of the most infamous deaths of the public depression era. And I consider him truly one of the most infamous public enemy number 1 of that era. So that was it. That was my top 10 FBI Depression era public enemy. Do you agree? Who else should have been on the list? Who do you think is number 1? Please write those names down. Write those opinions down in the comments. And until the next video, this has been the Steven Hour, and so long for now.